everybody. Thank you for having me and hosting me here from Los Angeles. I'm going to talk a little bit about a perspective that IBM has on the marketing and advertising industry. And this comes out of our business think tank, which is called the Institute of Business Value. In one of my manifestations with IBM, I oversaw our think tank for media and entertainment. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about our view of consumers, talk a little bit about our view of trends that are affecting not just the shape of advertising and the look and feel, but also the revenues and the bottom line within the industry, and then talk a little bit about future radical scenarios and then planning across those scenarios. To give a little bit of backdrop on some of our thinking to date, about 6 years ago, we wrote a paper called Vying for Attention, in which we asserted that attention for consumers was the rarest input into the value chain. It was the thing everybody would be competing for in a more fragmented environment. Now, I know that's a trend we've heard a lot about today. We're going to dive into it a little bit and then talk about some of the bottom line or shifting revenue effects. In that particular paper, we wrote a lot at that point in time about brands becoming ever more important as the tent poles through the clutter. So as there was a deluge of content and a variety of channel explosion, user voices, branded voices, new brands, old brands, all competing for that same attention, we talked a lot about brand connotation helping to guide, whether it was in a curating format, whether it was as an advisor, as a trusted voice, but really the brand becoming more and more important. 3 years ago, we wrote a paper called The End of Television as We Know It. And the thesis of that paper was that we're really living in a bimodal environment, and we thought that we would be for about the next 5 years. Now, when the subculture kids, as we're tracking them today, becomes head of household, then I think we're looking at cataclysmic change. But until that point, we really think we're living in a quite diversified marketplace of consumers. And in that segmented market, or that bimodal market, we really believe that you have to have a bifurcated strategy. Your marketing messages need to be very segmented. Your supply chain needs to be segmented. You need to hang on to the traditional for those passive viewers while experimenting with new digital supply chains. The sales strategy, the sales reach, and even the pricing all needs to be tailored for those different consumer segments. And then last year, we wrote a paper called Navigating the Media Divide, where we looked at the inherent conflicts and strategies coming up between content owners and distributors as each were seeking new forms of attention and relationships with users, and how we really saw these symbiotic partnerships of the past starting to come into collision in the future. Now, all of that is backdrop for what we're going to talk about today, which is very much focused on advertising. Now, as part of the advertising work, we did several forms of both secondary and primary research. For this paper, one of the outlets of primary research was talking to nearly 2,500 consumer households worldwide. We spoke to consumers in 5 countries in the US, in the UK, in Germany, in Japan, and Australia. Certainly not exhaustive, but at least it could give us a way to directionally understand how consumers were feeling and how their propensities compared to one another. We then talked with C-level executives. In fact, we interviewed Sir Martin Sorrell as but one of the executives that we talked to for this paper. We also, with the University of Bonn, did an executive panel where we talked to about 80 to 100 advertisers, buying executives, advertising agency executives, and production executives to really find out from the supply side how they expected to be reallocating their budgets, how they would be reacting to some of these consumer trends. So that is the backdrop on today. Let me tell you a little bit, a little bit about what I had hoped to cover. Now I'm going to try my best not to be repetitive. Going at the very end of a very data-intensive day like today means some of the themes are going to be overlapping to what you've heard. I will try to move through those as quickly as possible and stay on some of the new areas of interest to the best I can, given the presentation was already created before today. But the first thing I'd like to explore is a little bit more about our view of consumers and really dive into what we mean by this bimodal marketplace. The second area I thought we'd talk about is the trends. Again, the trends that are leading to economic shifts, not just trends for trend's sake, but what is impactful for the players today. That's what we call the end of advertising as we know it, this real shift in the next 5 years of revenues and bottom line effects. And then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about a scenario envisioning exercise we ran through. And this is really about radicalizing views of the future and then trying to plan appropriate actions against them. And it's something we certainly work on with many of our entertainment and media clients as well as our advertising agency clients. So those are the three areas that I'll like to cover in about 30 minutes. Now this is our view in a snapshot of consumers. We like to think of it as bifurcated, two real modes here. Now clearly this is a very top-level segmentation, and there would be dozens, if not hundreds, of subsegments. But clearly the biggest group in our mind that is about 70% of the viewing and media consuming audience is what we call the massive passives. Massive, of course, because they're the biggest. Passive because they generally, for their media consumption, are not really inspiring nor demanding a great deal of change in their media existence. This might be considered the revenue generation or the cash annuity of the marketplace. This is really the group that's going to help fund the experiments of the more profitable, more avant-garde other consumers. Now, we look at the gadgeteers and the cool kids. We think those together are about 30% of the market. Now, we've tested these with other companies like MTV and others, and we have very similar views of the breakdown of these types of consumers. So, gadgeteers, a highly involved, interactive set of self-sufficient, fast-moving, well-traveled, high disposable income users. This is where we think the profits of this marketplace really are, both for media and for advertising. The gadgeteers, of course, a smaller group, but a growing group, and one that has more money than time. Now you can make that converse to the cool kids that have more time than money. We talk about the cool kids as the subculture, sub-24-year-olds, the group that's really peer-to-peer focused, mobile focused. They've had a lot of, for example, value destruction in the media industry. Now, again, when we think this group becomes head of household, that's when we expect to see real seismic shifts. But until that point, we think of this as a bimodal, generational chasm type of environment. Now, the gadgeteers tend to be young or young at heart professionals. The cool kids, once again, sub-24. And then the massive passives skew a little bit older. Now, clearly, when you think about media formats or marketing formats, you can start to then see that much of the experimentation that we're talking about is somewhat focused on the massive passives, but in good portion is focused at the gadgeteers, again, the profitable but smaller group. The massive passives themselves also need innovation in terms of the kinds of messages and media and entertainment and the content and the way it's packaged to them. But a lot of what we're focusing on is the gadgeteer and the cool kid, but we, however, tend to stress the full way to run a business. Now, in part because many of our clients, the media companies, have analog businesses, they have very large legacy infrastructures, and they still need to be around because they still need to serve this massive passive audience. But concurrent to that, they have to build a secondary supply chain that's often digital. Their skills, their capabilities, and the infrastructure all has to change to be digital. What this means generally, and this is a hard lesson to swallow, is that efficiency needs to be baked into the traditional infrastructure more than ever before. It has to be leaner than ever before so that it can throw off more cash in order to fund the experimentation that's ever more necessary in this environment. As you've heard today, there are experiments happening, but we don't know in all cases what will actually win. Sometimes campaigns become explosively popular and sometimes they're flat. And this is the kind of thing that requires real-life, qualitative research, real-life experiments, and some longitudinal ways of understanding consumers. So once again, this is a hard lesson for many of our clients to hear, is that even though this is a cash cow today, right now in that period of success, it needs to be more efficient than ever. It really needs to take cost-cutting measures so that there is the ability to experiment for the cool kids and for the gadgeteers, which really are the future. One of the things I wanted to do here was talk a little bit about fragmentation and content aggregation and eyeball aggregation. What we've done here through the research that we did in those 5 countries was lay it out by some of the traditional ways to reach media, and then of course its companion marketing. And then we looked at online, both social and branded content experiences, and then portable and mobile. And while I don't expect you to read all the fine print, I think the colors themselves tell a story. The dark green is what we consider mass adoption. That is where that particular segment, and of course we have the age bracket starting young to a little bit older over there, cool kids to massive passives. The dark green, for example, is mass adoption. The red is niche adoption at under 10%. And what you can see very clearly, for example, is that the cool kids have an incredible penetration in social networks. For our 5 countries, we saw nearly 75% on social networks. So that is where their eyeballs are aggregating. That's where their experiences are aggregating. Conversely, if you look at the top line, you see that premium video content or broadcast and packaged content into the living room for the massive passives is still coming through traditional ways. So what that means is that the suppliers, as we've known them in the past, are still aggregating the content and still participating in aggregating the eyeballs. We assert in this way, just like in the last slide, that we are no longer in a one-size-fits-all, and everything that we need to do as suppliers also cannot be one-size-fits-all. This is another way to look at that same information. Social networking, cool kids 3 times as likely to be on a social network, massive passives 3 times as likely as their counterpart, cool kids, to have premium cable or satellite. Now, one of the things we also did is rather than just inferring the relationship between advertising and content and users, we thought we'd start asking some direct questions about it. In our survey, we asked if the user would be willing to pay for content if that ensured they had an ad-free environment. So in other words, pay to avoid ads. What we found is that the massive passives were much more willing than the youth audience to pay for an ad-free environment, 43%. Now, we tested a series of price points, and there was a variety of price sensitivity, certainly. But nonetheless, 43% kind of blew us out of the water. We did not expect that there would be that many users willing to pay to have an environment in which there was no advertising. Now, the cool kids, still a quarter of them said they might consider that same model. It's not necessarily a surprise given that they have more time than money. So they're more price sensitive than their counterpart massive passives. Nonetheless, we thought this was a very interesting opportunity. Now, as a producer of content, so many of our clients, a studio or a broadcast network, this all of a sudden is an opportunity for them to fund their content as they never have before. 50% of entertainment in many categories is funded through advertising. So the changes in advertising really hits their production budgets. So information like this, while perhaps changing the relationship of a brand to a consumer or a brand to a piece of content, does, however, open up new opportunities for the media executive. Now, one of the things I thought that would be interesting is to hear directly from the cool kids themselves. And I'm going to play you a video that was done in a focus group about 12 months ago. Still quite active.
I'm going to give you these, and what I'd like you guys to do is together look at these, kind of put them in the order of the most important to least important, and then figure out like why. Here's the list of them, and go ahead.
Internet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I need to have internet.
Personal. Yeah.
Yes, that's my
That's very
Okay, so
important.
that's after.
Cell phone.
Cell phone next.
So I think it should be cell phone, internet, iPod.
What's Victrola?
Oh yeah, that's important.
What is it?
You have TiVo, radio, personal computer, Xbox, and my
You said internet first because there's a bunch of different things you can do on the internet. And it's helpful because you can communicate with your friends and like family.
I'm really passionate about my personal computer.
Well, I think it's important, but like not necessary because you can do a lot of other stuff with your free time than watch programs.
Which is more fun, internet or TV?
internet.
I think one of the reasons we put computer before TV is because nowadays, like, we have TV shows on the computer.
Oh yeah.
And that you can download onto your iPod.
iPod are important to me, I guess, because, well, I love music, and I was growing up with music.
You can play like all these games, and you can have TV shows on your computer, on the internet and stuff. So you can have 2 in 1.
You know, some of the TV networks don't want people to be able to download TV shows or look at them on their computers.
So if you use more of the stuff on TV, then it's better for the TV companies. But if you watch it more on the internet, then it's only good for internet companies.
Who here has TiVo? Do you watch ads?
Well, see, that's why my mom likes TiVo because we can just fast forward the ads. But someone who was looking for a car was looking for car commercials, but if everyone was getting TiVo, then they would skip all the commercials and they would never buy a car.
Would you like to be the president of a TV network?
I wouldn't. It would be so stressful.
No. Because they're going to lose all their money eventually.
You have your music, you have your TV shows, you have your movies, you have your, like, not your Xbox, but you can play games like Xbox on your computer. You have MySpace, you have email, you have IM, you have everything on your computer.
It's like taken over everything.
Music
TV is
stores.
going down, and like Xbox is going down, radio's going down.
Like the stock market, it goes up and down and stuff. I think right now the computers would be at the top and everything would be kind of going down and stuff.
So it kind of drives the point home from what we've been hearing today. So all this is by way of backdrop. Now we'll switch into how we think some of this applies to the advertising space. Clearly, I think much of it is implied in what we just heard. But we'd like to go through a little bit more from our consumer study, present a little bit about how we frame the issues. Again, there may be some overlap to earlier today and words that you've already started hearing, but we'll tell you a little bit about how we frame the issues and how we talk with clients through dialogue. We really think there are 4 key trends that are shaping not just how the industry looks and what kind of formats are offered, but really starts to address the shifting revenues of the marketplace and ultimately helps determine who wins or loses in this marketplace. So there are 4 things that we really look at. We look at the balancing shift of control between consumers and providers of content, providers of marketing. The second we look at is creativity and the broadening number of participants in it. Now, someone earlier today called it democratization. We call it creative populism. But more voices participating in what we know to be creative development. Not just users, but also content owners getting closer and closer to advertisers. So we think this calls into the question not just the consumer experience, but what it means to be an agency in the future if content owners are now starting to partner directly with advertisers. The 2 other areas that we're going to talk about have not been talked about as much today, and they're admittedly less sexy, but I don't think any less important, in fact, perhaps more important. Those 2, moving to individualized metrics. So we've lived in a world thus far that's had siloed metrics. So for the internet, you have net ratings or buzz metrics. For music, you have SoundScan. For the television, you have Nielsen ratings. But we have yet to see them all come together, have them extracted from the multiple repositories. Even within one company, that information doesn't get extracted, normalized, brought together, and whatnot. But certainly, we're still very much living in a sampled world, and we certainly need to get to a more individualized or segmented world. So if we're going to talk the talk and walk the walk, our metrics need to follow, and all of the tracking that goes with that and the data crunching also has to be oriented towards the individual and the segment, not just the general population or inference from a piece of content. The last item we really look at is the issue of ad inventory. So this is the process by which large blocks of media are bought and sold, or advertising units bought and sold. And we really see this last one as ripe for change. There is, in many cases, a non-transparent, inefficient way that media is bought and sold. And I think if we look at, for example, the U.S. upfronts, which are just starting to be reported for this year, we see a small number of buyers and a small number of sellers selling or trading $9 billion worth of inventory. And instead, I think what we're going to see is a more open network system, a more open exchange system. And we already see some partners coming to the fore who are creating or redefining what it means to be an ad unit, helping to shift the way things are bought and sold and the currencies that go along with it. Now, we think all of this is important because advertising has generally in the past been a zero-sum game. Advertising grows with the strength of the industry, not with these trends. And therefore, for every winner, let's say a technology partner comes in and explosively is successful with ad exchanges, that money comes from somewhere else, and in that case, maybe it comes from a traditional media buyer. So we're very interested in not just the size of the pie, but who gets the bigger pieces of the pie. One of the things we look at is control. And DVRs came up earlier today. DVRs are a very interesting story because often users, and I have a DVR, and I am a huge fan of my DVR, or PVR as it's sometimes called, or TiVo if you go with the brand name. But users tend to overreport how much ad skipping they do, which is good news. However, the net is still there is a great deal of ad skipping happening. And certainly in our study, the majority of users who did have a TiVo, and they generally showed up in our survey in the UK and the US, were doing about 55% of their watching as they reported it with ad skipping. So this is a tremendous loss, not just to the advertiser in terms of impressions, but also, once again, the media companies who are relying pretty heavily on advertising to fuel their efforts and fund their very expensive episodes. Now, when we talk to our B2B panel, so when we talk to the agencies, the buyers, and the producers about how that would affect the bottom line, we saw that, let me grab that data point, a third thought there would be, half thought there would be a 30% movement from the 30-second spot from impression measures to impact measures. So what that meant is as DVR ad skipping was penetrating, that there was expected to be a good amount of rebudget allocation, and that was in a 3-year time frame. So once again, it wasn't so much the trend that surprised us, it was that in the short time frame of expectation. So we're going from cause to effect. Now, the other thing we also tracked was cannibalization. So what are the effects of one screen on another screen? So what we did is profile in the UK, one of the more advanced mobile markets that we tested, what would happen when users started watching mobile video? How did that cannibalize the other ways in which they received television, for example? And in this particular case, nearly a third of the users reported they were using their new mobile device instead of their traditional TV for the same content. And so, once again, this impacts who aggregates the content and who gets to resell, whether it's subscription, pay-per-view, or whatnot, or resell the eyeballs. And so we're very interested, once again, in the shifting revenues that these trends imply. Now, we've talked a lot about user participation in the content process, and we certainly found no different. With the exception of Japan, who has a much more suppressed inclination towards user contribution and participation in social networks, we found a pretty healthy participatory bent. For example, in the US, 26% of all of our respondents said they had contributed to a social networking site. It was about 20% in the UK, and again, Japan is much more suppressed compared to the others, and it was about 9% there. But pretty healthy nonetheless. The other thing we looked at was creative participation by non-agency partners as another way for the creative development process to change. And so here we highlight some content owners who are getting into the production mix for campaigns. Condé Nast, their media group, has been producing either at cost, below cost, or for free media campaigns. You also see MTV, for example, working directly with Doritos to create 1-minute episodes online to launch their new potato brand, When Spicy Meets Sweet. So they created an online dating show where you had sort of a bad girl and a good boy, as it were, or vice versa, When Spicy Meets Sweet. Now, there's also different kinds of integrations. Some are done with agencies, clearly, some without. But in the case of NBC, this was an in-show buy at which they launched a marketing widget. And so the Jay Leno show, a very popular show, launched and introduced and actually demoed a marketing widget for Dockers, and then that campaign went side by side online and was tremendously successful. That launched about 2 weeks ago. So now when we look at individualized metrics, and this was the statistic that I was speaking to earlier, we're very interested in the individualization of metrics and how, in fact, that happens. Now, underpinning this change is a lot of data and tracking that needs to happen that's never happened before. So when we talk about social networking or we talk about the network effect, what really needs to happen is a tracking of that network and understanding who the key influencers are. And it's not theoretical, that's very data-driven. For each network, there generally are a couple of people that are at the center of that network who really bring that network together and disseminate messages within that network. With this social networking, for example, there's a changing view of what it means to be an authentic voice or a creative voice or an influential voice. So finding those influencers is all the more important. Those couple of people often are also relevant to other networks. And so finding out who you must target in a marketing campaign is terribly important, and that's all based on data. When we talk to ad professionals, once again, about what this means from going from impression-based to impact-based, or from a sampled set to a more segmented set, once again, there was a pretty dramatic shift of the revenues. And so in this case, once again, within the 3-year time frame, and I'd referred to this earlier, the majority of our panel expected about a fifth of the revenues to move to impact-based measures. And with things like marketing widgets, there's new lexicon that's coming to the fore, things like cost per engagement or cost per install, CPE or CPI instead of CPM. And then next, we also looked once again at the inventory system when we tested not just the user inclination, but also the advertising inclination towards these kinds of new models. And what we learned is that half of our panel expected an auction player or an open exchange to take 30% of the total revenues from the incumbent kinds of exchanges or closed environments. So 30% moving to an open environment from a closed environment. Once again, this means that there needs to be a new infrastructure set up to respond to that kind of demand. Once again, that also means new intermediaries in the mix that are perhaps displacing some of the legacy. So we are looking not just at the consumer trends of control and creative populism, which are consumer plus also institutional, but also trying to assess the underlying foundational building blocks and the ways they shift revenues. So when we think about the so what, or the outcome of all of this, the net effect of all of these kinds of trends, and we look 4 or 5 years into the future, we like to think about who is set up, given these trends, to win or lose in this environment. And so what you see here, the color scheme, the legend, is green means a premier economic value position, so profitability. The yellow means a moderate value position. The red means a non-differentiated value position. Now, there are always ways to overcome these kinds of determinations, but given trends, this is who we see most at risk, and this is who we see most set up to succeed. So for example, we see the advertiser with more channels and more people vying for their wallet. There's a great deal of implied negotiating power that comes with that, and the ability to experiment in new ways with new partners. We also see the consumer, of course, who can ultimately tune out, filter, and block the messages, as well as the media, as also in a powerful position. Now, we've seen things in the US like the do not call list, which stops direct marketing by telephone. We've seen spam blockers around the world. We've seen TiVo. We know that consumers are already bucking against interruption advertising in some ways and forms. We also see interactive media buying, planning, and measurement as a winning position. The companies who are really poised to create stickiness, contextual and relevant campaigns, and who can really track and deliver the ROI to the new breed of CMOs who really require it. The new breed of CMO who's been steeped in internet metrics and who is taking that expectation into all of the categories of response. The people we see most at risk, the unevolved agency who's not really testing new formats, who is not investing in new measurements, who is not mining the vast amounts of data internally to become insight brokers, not just creative brokers, but insight brokers. We also see the traditional measurement system, which is not based on individualized metrics and tracking, as a place of risk. So this is our general gut assessment based on the trends that we saw. Once again, we're doing our best to tie them to the bottom line. Okay. Now what I want to do is tell you a little bit about a process we use when we help customers, as well as ourselves, plan for the future. And it's based on a program that Shell Oil brought to the fore about 20 years ago, something called scenario planning. And effectively, you try to radicalize views of the future and then create a strategy for dealing with that what if. And we would say, through this bifurcated philosophy, that you really need to do all of these at once. But the way scenario planning works is you choose the most disruptive 2 variables in your estimation. And here we chose marketing control, or consumers filtering, blocking, and crafting their own message experiences and brand experiences. Or is the provider pushing those? So we have the provider and the consumer. On the y-axis, we look at the ad inventory systems. Once again, going back to this idea of a closed system versus an open system. And when you put those things together, you come up with 4 scenarios. Now, these are not as radical as they could be because we brought them into a 4 to 5 year time frame. If we were talking 10 to 15 years out and those cool kids were heads of household, then I think we'd have a very different view of the future. Perhaps even 8 to 10 years, we'd have a very different view of what it would mean to be radical. But this is radical within our time frame. So for example, in the consumer choice example, this would be a world in which consumers block all interruption advertising. So if you were to test yourself on what that would mean, all of a sudden creativity and experimentation takes on a much different view. If we're to live in a world of all open exchanges, that would mean new technology entrants dominate, and who would they be displacing, and how would there be a preemptive kind of set of strategies? And then in the top right corner, add marketplace. This is where both the formats, or what consumers see, and the back end, what they don't see, they both come together in a brand new scenario, and that's really where all bets are off. There's no legacy player. Here, legacy players of all form have the stronghold. Here, the current back end has the stronghold, but all the consumer-facing inventories have to change and formats have to change, and here's the reverse. And so we would assert that all of these things are already happening. And going back to this idea of massive passives, clearly, this is a scenario that favors the tendencies of the massive passives. Here, the gadgeteers, and here, the technology intermediaries. If all of these things are happening, what's one to do? What I'd like to do to address that is talk a little bit about some of the experiments that are happening in each. So first, I'd like to look at consumer control. So if this is a world in which consumers are outright rejecting interruption advertising, what are some ways to try to overcome that objection, to make it more relevant, make it more contextual, make it more laser-focused, if you will? There are a couple of examples doing just that. For example, there's a company in New York called Visible World that's in the pilot stage with cable operators in the US. And effectively, it's doing micro-versioning of spots. So on the fly, in real time, it can take your creative, mix and match hundreds of pieces to create thousands or tens of thousands of spots. And so once it has an indicator of who is sitting before a screen, it can then tailor every aspect of that creative campaign for that person. And because it's automated, it means it's scalable. The second way in which some providers are dealing with this is asking for the permission of users into the campaign, so creating an opt-in format. And there are a couple of ways in which that's happening. Sugar Mama in the UK creates a value proposition. They will trade minutes if users will watch advertising. So all of a sudden, there's a value agreement. And there is the permission-based brand experience that the user is giving that overcomes the objection of the interruption. Secondly, there are other companies like MyClick or mobile barcodes that are very popular in Asia. And I think MyClick is also functioning in relation with the Sun newspaper in the UK. I believe there's an experiment happening there too. But once again, you'll see images or barcodes. Data is embedded in the barcode. What that means is a user sees something of interest, will tag the barcode with their mobile phone, receive content, receive video, receive discounts, whatever is included. But once again, it's a permission-based way of doing things. Now, the next way is a content bleed, and it's overcoming the objections of the interruption by making advertising look more and more like entertainment. And this campaign was already referred to by Patu, but it's highlighting folks like Alicia Keys that are ultimately watchable, that are infinitely watchable, and making them part of a brand story that has a story arc that's most similar to entertainment. So it's about characters, it's character-driven dilemma, and it's not about, per se, the brand, although the brand is woven in. Those are a couple of ways to address, and how companies are addressing currently, this issue of control that consumers want and their reaction to certain forms of messaging. Now I'd like to look at open exchanges. Now, we're all aware of what Google has done with search and auction-based online. What's very interesting about Google is they've also taken that exchange mentality and they've moved into radio and into television. And I think what hasn't been addressed is that not only is Google taking that inventory management skill, but they're also collecting data from all of those points and categories. And I think before long, they will be poised to be data mining analytics across channels, so getting to that cross-channel revenue mix and optimization that no one really has. There are a couple of people who are certainly trying, but that no one has sort of mastered to date. And so they will have the ultimate digital dashboard, all the analytics and the inventory that underpin it. So I think that's why we're watching Google, not just because of what they've already done, but the ways in which they're going to migrate those skills and what it implies for the visibility they'll have about consumers, their inventory, and how money is changing hands. Excuse me. Now, So there are a couple of other companies that are doing similar things. Black Arrow is a company, also California-based, that is working with cable companies, a consortia of cable companies, to create new ad units around video-on-demand spots, as well as IPG and other forms of new advertising formats. So what they are doing is aggregating on behalf of all the cable operators, all the major cable operators, a new inventory system, how they're defining the units and how they're creating currency and pricing for those companies. There's also a company, LA-based, called Next Medium. They're doing the same thing for product placement. Whereas before, product placement happened much like the US up front. So you'd have a couple of players who would, Volkswagen might work with NBC Universal, they'd create a cross-company packaged deal, but it was between a few players and a few players on both sides. Next Medium has now created a whole set of categories of product placement, foreground, background, in dialogue, et cetera, et cetera. And they have a couple of broadcasters that are investing in them and creating inventory with and for them. What that means is that any advertiser, big and small, can now go in, see the inventory, and start placing in a more transparent, more efficient manner. It does not mean that the broadcaster or the inventory holder gives away the house. In fact, what they do is they create a floor of the kind of pricing they would want attached to that product placement. They might put parameters around what category would be appropriate for it, but they're allowing a much greater volume of participation, believing that that's how they increase revenues for that particular format. So once again, these are people playing with what it means to be an inventory unit and the pricing and the currency exchange. Once again, because this is a zero-sum game, who wins here takes money out of somebody else's pocket. Now lastly, I'll speak to the most radical scenario, the most disruptive scenario. This one's a little bit difficult to talk to because there aren't that many examples functioning in that upper right box. A couple to bring to the fore: P2P brand dissemination through things like marketing widgets. Widgets are 2 to 3 times as popular in the US. Every computer has hundreds, if not thousands, of small embeddable codes already on them. What's different in today's market is that they're now being used as branded widgets. Paul spoke to this, Patu spoke to this. This has come up. What's interesting, for example, is that in the Sears prom dress campaign, they created a widget where girls could go in, choose the dresses they might want to purchase for the prom, and then send that marketing widget to all their friends for feedback. So all of a sudden, you are using the power of the network to not just have a personal dialogue, but also a brand dialogue. Something else to bring up. This is taking the sugar mama concept, for example, much farther. There's a company, a startup, that mostly works in emerging countries called Pudding Media. And effectively, in places where telcos, for example, don't have a high ARPU and users are not able to have a lot of add-on extras to their telco subscription, in this particular case, Pudding Media will ask them if they would like another set of services or free calls. And then in response, they listen to advertising. But it doesn't just stop there. Pudding Media tracks their SMS text. They also do voice recognition on the call they place. What that means is, like Gmail, they're now collecting all of this information on that particular user, and they're doing targeted advertising based on that input. So it's very interesting because this is taking the opt-in or permission-based model much farther by adding the tracking and the individualization to it. So these are a couple of examples of taking the trends we spoke about a little bit further. Now, we've talked a lot about the need to experiment and the need to be working in all of those scenarios at once. And we've also talked about the need of making your current traditional programs much leaner so that there's cash flow to support the experiments. When we talk about innovation, we talk about experimentation, we tend to think about 3 major areas. We talk a lot about consumer centricity, really putting the consumer at the centerpiece of the business. We go so far as to recommend a chief consumer officer to our media company clients, to our retail clients, but really making sure there's an advocate for the consumer in the boardroom. We've talked a lot about this already, about micro-segmentation, about contextual advertising, about media experiences that are personalized along with brand experiences that are personalized, and using the connection and the network effect and the two-way dialogue as a central component. Now again, all of this is underpinned by better data, better tracking, better measurement. We also talk about business model innovation or experimentation and the need to rethink every aspect of the revenue stream. So rethinking the partnerships, the pricing, and the formats. This may be working with inventory holders and asking for some sort of open exchange. It may mean for the broadcasters to release part of their ad inventory. Experimenting where it hasn't been done before. And then lastly, we talk a lot about the agility and flexibility that has to be baked into every single business in the advertising value chain. None of this is achievable if there isn't a horizontality, a breaking down between silos, between P&Ls, between channels, between all the various skills organizationally. It also means bringing data together from disparate sources, across partnerships, across borders, even across business units, of really making that data sing by bringing it together and doing analysis on top of it. So with that, I will leave you. We, once again, really just have this mantra of experimentation, and we like to think about experimentation falling in these three ways, and believing that is how you are poised to compete across whatever scenario comes to the future. So with that, I will close. Thank you for having me.